Well, without further ado, thank you again, all of you, for being here. And my name is Aeffia. I am a long-time activist. I've been well, for me, I'm not that old, but for 10 years I've been an activist my entire adult life. And I became an activist specifically for Rojava and for Kurdish people in Kurdistan, I think now like 6 years ago. And it's been very meaningful to me. It's been very inspiring to me. And what I hope to do today is share with you a little bit about what I've learned in my own research. My thesis was on the city of Qamishlo in Syria, and express to you some of the joy and interesting things that I found from this and how it might be useful to our own space in Boston. I live in Boston, I'm local here, and yeah, so, all right, real deal, starting. So, essentially, I just want to start from here. Hi, new people. Essentially, I want to start with just the basics. So I'm assuming most people here either, are at least very familiar at some point with the Kurds. I assume that's why you're here. But just, for the basics, Kurdish people are an ethnic and linguistic group. They're indigenous to an area of the Middle East, which is now between Iran, Turkey, Syria, and Iraq, thank you. And their history goes back a very long time. Kurdish people are practically an ancient people. They've been around a very, very long time. And Kurdistan, specifically, is this region. It's in the Middle East. I had a beautiful, beautiful picture, which I wasn't able to print out at the library that had closed. But you can imagine in your head that right smack in the middle of the Middle East, between these four countries, there's this landmass which is essentially between these four countries, and that is Kurdistan. And so historically, Kurdistan was had some autonomy as like kind of a region and as a government after the Ottoman Empire, but that all changed when the Ottoman Empire collapsed under World War I. And suddenly, the Kurds found themselves in this predicament where they wanted to have their own country. I'm sure lots of activists here are familiar with that struggle for self-determination. I know we have some Palestine activists here, so we're all familiar. And they were promised their own land, and they weren't given it. And as a result, today, Kurds are the largest stateless people in the world. Is it like 30 million, 40 million people?
Million. It's hard to calculate since it's all unofficial.
Yeah, unofficial. There's no real good numbers on it, unfortunately. But yeah, they're the largest stateless minority in the world. And they have been fighting for independence, revolution, self-determination now for, more than 100 years?
Right.
Yeah. And so the question is, what does that look like? So if you think about Kurdistan, the largest area of Kurdistan today is Kurdistan in Turkey. And that's kind of where this revolutionary movement starts. So if you imagine you're a Kurdish person, you're living in, I guess, post-World War I, right before the end of World War I, and you think you're going to get your own state, and then turns out these colonial forces actually want to cut up what you thought would be your country into 4 different other countries. And suddenly, you find that you, your neighbors, your family are literally living in different states. And so that was the predicament Kurdish people found themselves in. For Kurdish people in Turkey, which was the largest part of Kurdistan, the largest segment that was broken up, there was a lot of organizing. There were movements going back to, I think, 1910s, 1920s, Sheikh Said's revolt in the, I believe, the 20s, which was... it wasn't successful, and a lot of people got pushed into Syria as refugees, but there was movement and there was momentum always. So this momentum keeps going, and we get into the 60s and the 70s, and of course there's this kind of anti-imperial movement that's going through the world. This movement to have people be able to self-determine, to have their own country, to be able to have rights. And the Kurds want into this, right? So we see this creation of a group called the PKK. Does anyone here, people all familiar with the PKK? All right.
Yeah.
Cool. We have a very informed crowd, I assume.
No, is there anyone who might want to chair too?
Oh, yeah, we should give those off. All right, momentary, we are giving some chairs to people in the back. So, there's a movement around how to get liberation in Turkey. So, it's not just that people have been separated, but as minorities, which they've been turned into minorities intentionally by these imperial forces, they're facing this kind of terrible discrimination. Specifically in Turkey, there's this idea of Turkification. It's the idea that there is one ethnicity in Turkey, and that is to be Turkish. And so with this kind of, and under this oppressive lens of what ethnicity looks like, we have things like the Armenian genocide. And we have these terrible, awful events where they kill and forcibly exile all these people who do not fit the mold of what it means to be in that state. So under this oppressive lens, Kurdish people start to develop the PKK. And they say, we're going to have an independent Kurdistan, and they're Marxist-Leninist, and they have this movement, and they start in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and they actually start fighting against the state of Turkey, and there's a huge civil war which still goes on till this day. And in that fight, there was this momentum to have their own state, to be able to have freedom, not just for themselves, but to have freedom for all of Kurdistan. And it has a lot of tragedies. I think that's maybe the best way to put it. People are fighting, but despite the fight that they put up, there's so much death. There's so much intense state violence against the PKK and against Kurdish people who aren't even in the PKK. And eventually, in 1999, the head of the PKK, Abdullah Öcalan, who we'll hear more about, he tries to flee and get asylum in Europe. And while he's there, he gets captured by Mossad, by the United States, by a few forces who are working together. And he gets put on this prison island. And literally today, he has been in solitary confinement for 25 years. And he's in this position, and he's in jail. He only sees his lawyer, I think, once a month. And he's like, something's going wrong here. Like, this fight we're trying to do, this is not happening the way I want it to happen. And while all this is happening, while he goes to prison, there's this movement towards feminism in Kurdistan. There's a huge feminist movement. And in addition to that, there's a kind of unrest. And he starts to question himself, and he thinks, well, the PKK's objectives aren't working. Not the objectives exactly, but something about the way we're doing things isn't quite going well. So let me think about this. And he starts to question, like, we want this Kurdish state. Is that actually the answer? And so then he begins to look at different philosophers. He looks at this Jewish guy from Brooklyn, Murray Bookchin, who starts this idea of communalism, which is about this direct democracies and ground-up governance. And he says, well, instead of having this top-down structure, what if we had a bottom-up structure? And what if we said we could have our government really anywhere that we are, regardless of the borders? The borders came to us, and by trying to seek out and create this state, we might actually create some of the oppressive patterns that we ourselves suffered from. And so he creates this new theory called democratic confederalism, which is very interesting. Anya's going to talk about it later, which is all about direct democracy, bottoms up. It's about women's liberation and incorporates the feminist movement that was really powerful and continues to be powerful in Kurdish culture. And it incorporates ecology and environmentalism. So he writes this up. He's in prison. He's writing these books. He's still writing books from prison. And meanwhile, in Syria, there's a civil war going on. 2011, there's a civil war. Bashar al-Assad, he attacks his protesters, and there becomes this huge civil war between Bashar al-Assad and a bunch of other people, including the Free Syrian Army, so many groups. And while that's happening, there's Kurds in Syria, and many of them are influenced by Abdullah Öcalan, and sorry, I'm just admitting someone into the Zoom room. By Abdullah Öcalan and by the teachings of the PKK. They're very, very influenced by this. They want to be part of this movement. And when the troops leave, so basically like Bashar al-Assad, he's like, I have to protect Damascus and what's immediately in front of me. So he pulls his troops out of Syrian Kurdistan. And when he pulls out, all the democratic movements, which had already been starting in Kurdistan, they're like, we're creating our own government. They create what's today known as the Autonomous Administration of North-Eastern Syria. And they say, what if we took these theories that we've been building, that Öcalan's been building, this idea of democratic confederalism, which we can't do in Turkey, it's way too oppressive right now. And what if we do it here? Because the military just left. And so there becomes this movement to create this bottom-up democracy. And that's what I think was so inspiring to me. It's why I started learning about this. And Anya, she's been there.
Yeah.
And just to be clear, this place has been here since 2011 and it got formalized in 2014. So this thing's 10 years old, at least, at this point.
Yeah, I kind of have a feeling that most of you are already familiar with that history, but I think it was good to lay out the basics, just in case we have new folks in the room. Yeah, so in theory, again, it's direct democracy, starting with local assemblies on the neighborhood level, sending delegates to the neighborhood town council or district council, and then higher up, and then connecting different...
Pause for a second, I'm just moving this closer so they can hear you.
Yeah, so that's the theory. But then when you get there, you, of course, inevitably going to see that that's not how things work in practice. So I'm going to talk more, right, how things are actually working in practice. So democratic confederalism is the ideal, right, the blueprint that they're trying to implement, but there are so many internal and external challenges that they're facing that things that just don't look the same in practice. And I think it actually makes it more interesting, right? If the goal for us is to actually learn from the revolution and see how these ideals can actually be implemented. And I'll just go, I guess, through different aspects of organizing the revolution, starting with the communes, right? The linchpin of the revolution. Well, administratively, every person you meet is part of a commune, right? They're registered, they know where the office is. Usually they know the name of their commune, not always. But in practice, people don't often go there. So, I visited a commune building where the meetings are supposed to take place, right? The neighborhood meetings where people are supposed to discuss the local affairs and basically become their own government, right? Self-governance. The movement has encountered this difficulty that there's just no culture of participation on this level in that country. Neither is here, right? Or name me a country where people would be willing to participate in politics on such an intimate level and even be able, right, to spend so much time, right, on governing themselves. And so what's happening right now? I've talked to some activists, some people working within the movement, right? The people who have the ideology and try to bring it to the people, right? You can safely say that there is a movement, and there are general people. The population of the region is around 5 million, right? The movement was maybe dozens of thousands, because they had to organize clandestinely until the civil war broke out. So for the moment, what's happening with direct democracy is that the movement is trying to figure out how do we educate people, how do we create this democratic culture, how do we kind of convince the general public that this way of making politics, right, direct democracy versus representative democracy, which people are more used to, how do we convince them that this is a better approach to self-governance? And there's a lot of education going on. There are, certain things that work better, and that kind of gives you an idea, perhaps, like what's lacking. For example, normally, right, communes by theory are supposed to have a number of committees: education, health, self-defense, women's committee. There is a reconciliation committee, and this committee is supposed to have their own meetings and address various sectors of organizing. And one thing that has worked pretty well, apparently, from my conversations with locals is the reconciliation committee. which is kind of an institutionalized version of restorative justice, which is part of the alternative justice that the movement has set up. And it starts, they're trying to communalize politics through these local assemblies. They also try to communalize the justice system, right, by making the commune, the reconciliation committee, the main mechanism through which to address, for the moment, sort of civil cases, right, what we would consider here civil court cases. And that committee has worked pretty well. Why? Because it kind of caters to the actual need that a neighborhood has. So it looks like, to invigorate this participation, right, there must be found a way of communes to be meaningful for people's daily needs. There are other obstacles. I want to leave some stuff to kind of conversation after the presentation, but I can just give you an idea, right? We can talk later about how they also have a mix, right, of representative and direct democracy. So there are some bodies that you would call more state-like representative bodies, and we can discuss kind of what necessities, what exigencies of the time, right, of the context necessitated those. So they can try to find a balance. They need to make the society function, right? They can't wait until communes start working like they should be working in theory, so that they have to operate the government, and they do it to their best ability while also trying and developing the directly democratic aspect of the new political system. But I mentioned the reconciliation committees. I'm going to talk a little bit more.
Could you try again?
Someone is listening. We're not gonna, yes.
Thank you.
So and I think this is super important for the U.S. context. With the abolition having become such a popular idea over the last few years, the fact that the movement in Rojava has also been trying to transform completely radically the justice system. So what they have now, as I said, that they've institutionalized the traditional form of solving conflicts within communities by kind of calling on elders or people with authority within the community. And there are a lot of communities in Syria that still use that way. So they don't resort to the state, they don't go to the state. They do it within their own neighborhood or village. And so what the movement has done is to institutionalize it, to say, okay, now we actually have an ongoing mechanism, constant mechanism where people can come. So they come to the office of the communes, right, in their locality. And what makes it interesting, right, worth of learning about this new justice system is the principle, right? The main principle around which it's structured is reconciliation. Kind of the idea, the philosophy behind it is how can we address conflicts by trying to restore the balance within the neighborhood. And what that means is that the approach to justice that they take is mediation and getting people to talk to each other and trying to find a solution that's sort of agreeable to all the sides that are involved, and using social pressure, right? Inviting people who have authority within the neighborhood, inviting sort of, people who kind of have knowledge, right, in the eyes of that community, and putting social pressure, right? Instead of forcing people into decisions. So they make a big point that we don't want to impose a decision like it works in a regular, sort of Western type justice system. We don't want it to be a judge, right, who makes the decision that imposes on the sides. We want the parties talk as much as they need to talk, right, and come to a conclusion. And talk to each other after that, right? So the fear is when you pose a solution, neither side is satisfied, only one side is satisfied, and that breaks the balance within the community. And it's working. One reason it's working is it's sort of obligatory. It's a mandatory step, right? Whenever if there is a sort of civil case type of argument. Within the locality, people absolutely have to go to their commune and ask this committee to help them resolve this issue. They cannot go to the court. So like structurally, that's the first place you go to. And if things don't work out and the parties don't come to the conclusion, then the next step is, okay, you have an option to go to the court, and then there it works pretty much, how they actually inherited this system from the Syrian government. They changed the laws, right, removed like the terrible laws that the Syrian government had, but it operates, similar to the French system. And even there, right, once the case is at that level, even there is an attempt, an effort, and an encouragement for the people to kind of use more of alternative mechanism to get the issue solved. There are also women-specific justice mechanisms. There are women's houses. I mean, that's sort of a known element, right, of the revolution. And that's a specifically restorative justice mechanism that has been designed specifically to deal with marriage and family issues with an explicit goal of protecting women's rights in those cases. And these women's houses, as they're called, they kind of set up as, like the first level is the Women's Committee of the Commune. That's where the first step, if it doesn't, and it's like serves like a most local women's house. If the issue doesn't get solved there, then it gets sent up to the next level, district level, and then there's the city level. And they're run by women, so that's super important. It's very important. It's also strange because it's Middle East. It's not stereotypical to say it's a conservative culture. It is actually quite a conservative culture, right, when it comes to gender relationships. And it's a real breakthrough, right? You can see to which degree the women's movement has been successful because it's women who get to decide, right, if a woman experiences domestic violence. It's the women who get to decide what's going to happen to that woman and to her husband. And it's not just women who come to this mechanism, this restorative justice mechanism, it's also men. And again, structurally, it is set up in a way that they have to come because it's the first step. If you don't go to your women's house, you can't go, can't seek redress in courts. And so, there's kind of a level of acceptance after 10 years of this mechanism functioning, and it shows how the society has progressed, when it comes to women's liberation.
Anya, could I cut in for a moment? Yeah. I have an interesting quote. So while I was doing research on this, I ran into someone who actually was a judge in Rojava. And it was really interesting because he was a judge within this restorative justice system, not in the traditional sense. He was also a lawyer in the traditional sense, but after the revolution, he became a judge. And I remember speaking to her, and I asked her about the judicial system. I spoke to his wife, and I asked her about the judicial system and what it was like. And she told me such a funny story about her husband when he went in for training. She told me that when he went in to get trained, they said he had to go for 3 days. He couldn't come home. He had to stay there for 3 days and go through training. And when he came home, his wife asked him, "What did you do for 3 days?" And he said, "All they told me was respect women, listen to women, and try your best to understand women." So for 3 days straight. Different versions of that. And the point of it is, it's very funny. I remember her saying back, "Yeah, it's our turn. We're gonna, women are strong here." And the point I got away from that, which she was telling me, is it was interesting because I spoke to a lot of people who were, among the communes, interacted with all the government offices in Rojava, but they weren't necessarily part of the main party there. They weren't necessarily socialists. They weren't necessarily anarchists. They didn't necessarily share the revolutionary spirit, but they lived the revolutionary spirit, right? It's literally around them. And what was interesting to me was just to see how even for people who didn't necessarily share the same political opinions, that they benefited off of the system. Like, her rights, she benefited as a woman, her rights improved under that system, and also just like as a person who's able to go to court and have things, as you said, it was pretty relatively successful, to be able to just go through her daily life, there were benefits that she had. So anyways, you can... I'll take it back
no,
to you.
it's a good segue, right, to talk about women, and that's, I think, the most successful
Oh, yeah.
part of the revolution.
For sure. Everybody I talk to in Kurdistan,
Yeah.
all they ever they talk
Yeah.
constantly about women's rights.
Men a little bit have mixed feelings about it.
I'm a man who loved talking about women's rights. He started telling me about feminism.
Probably, yeah. I did meet some men who didn't think much of the women's revolution in Rojava, and they were, surprisingly open about it. But that's just to say there is still a lot of work to go with the project of liberating women. But yeah, I mean, just compared to the starting point, and the starting point is women can't live by themselves. They're not trusted, right? Women can have extramarital relationships that get killed for that. It's called honor killings, right? Still happening until now. Women couldn't go and get divorced before the revolution. So again, super conservative society at the starting point. And right now, in any institution you go to, you see women everywhere in high level positions. And it's been a very long struggle for them, right? It started within the PKK when Kurdish women saw a lot of pushback within the PKK, within the Kurdish guerrilla movement, where men, were not really willing to see them as their equals. Like they would literally send them home. Like, these women would come and to become guerrillas, and they would just send them home and say it's not a place for you, right? So it really started in the 1970s and 80s, and after these decades, they've reached results that are quite admirable and sort of unprecedented, and just to go through structural changes that allowed this and that allow further development of this women's project. It's the mechanism that they have set up institutionally to make sure that the women's voices are always heard in whatever institution you find yourself. So there are co-chairs. Right, every body of decision making has a co-chair system. It's one woman, one man. We can talk about sort of the binary, the fact that they have not progressed sort of on that aspect as much as when it comes to women, but still, right, in terms of women's rights, so it's a co-chair system that means women are always found in sort of the highest levels of decision making. Right?
Anya, do you want to just clarify for those, maybe everyone here is familiar, but just basically in every commune in Rojava, you need to have a dual system where there's men and women represented. And that does get into a binary, which we can also talk about later. But just to recognize that there is this idea that we must have women's voices in every level. And so that's why it's pretty hard. If you do anything in Rojava, you will always interact with just women, female people. You will have that experience.
Yeah, and in any institution, like I volunteered at the university, at autonomous university. They had a co-chair system. Like any institution you go to, you'll see that. They also have women's quotas, so that means any decision-making body has to have, now it's 50% women. They have women-only autonomous councils within any institutions. So like the way it worked at the university, they had a sort of general council that consisted of all teachers, and they would occasionally come together and have meetings and make decisions about the university affairs. And then they also had a women-only council, and there it was women who would talk about whatever stuff that they were concerned about. But the cool thing about this women's council, and I know like in itself having a women's council in your organization doesn't mean anything, right? Sometimes it just allows for women's issues to be sidelined. But what makes this unique, the way it works in Rojava, is that they have a veto power over any decisions that are taken by the mixed gender council, if it concerns women, right? So imagine if we had that on the Supreme Court when decisions about abortion came in, right? So that really helps, right? To ensure, right?
It's cool. And Anya, do you want to just briefly say, Anya you were a professor. You were like a visiting professor when you were there,
sort
right?
Of unofficially, yeah.
Unofficially visiting professor while she was there. For context, if anyone has questions later, that's why she knows stuff about Rojava University, because that's where you were. And Yeah. Well, I forgot what I was going to say. You can continue.
Talking about women.
Oh, you're talking about women. So yeah, anything that's considered a women's issue. So anything to do with domestic violence is considered a women's issue. It's because domestic violence disproportionately affects women, and so therefore it's considered a women's issue. Anything that has to do with divorce or with just things that generally have a more
And it's up to women to decide,
Yeah.
right, if it's a
Yeah.
women's issue or not, right? Yeah, but I did meet men, talking about the university, who would say, oh, we don't think women know what they want. Like, we don't think it's worth for them having their meetings. We don't think they talk about anything serious. And, education takes time, right?
yeah.
Right, so there's still a lot of, obstacles. But they do emphasize a lot education, as you said, right?
Yeah.
If you work in any position, in any capacity with the autonomous administration, you have to go through these trainings about women's liberation. Sometimes it's a few days, sometimes a few weeks, and you can take more than one. And especially, meaningful, anyone who's joining the military, they have to do that. Right? You don't get a gun unless you get brainstorm a little bit about women's liberation. And it's an ongoing process, right? I had a friend work in the university, and she would give these trainings to Arab men who were about to join the military, and she would have to argue with them why having 3 wives is not great for the society, right? So it's kind of, but it's still this so there's the principle of not imposing, kind of, you can see it through different aspects of the revolution, and like trying not to impose things when it comes to women's liberation. They've had to resort to that as well. I just mentioned Arab men. So in the Kurdish areas, this idea of women's liberation has been better accepted, right? Because they are Kurds, and they've been exposed to this ideology. It's their movement. They see it as their movement. But the defeat of ISIS led to the sort of joining of Arab majority areas to the what began as the Kurdish majority Rojava region. And those areas are much more conservative when it comes to women. And for example, they passed a bunch of laws protecting all the patriarchal practices, oppressive practices for women in the Kurdish areas, like polygamy, for example, right? But they were not able to pass those laws in the Arab majority regions. Those men just not gonna take it, right? Or, for example, talking about the education, genealogy, I think everyone knows what genealogy is, right? The women's science that the movement came up with, and now it's a mandatory subject across schools and at the university level. Like, you have to start learning about women's liberation from very early on, and that subject is not taught in the Arab majority regions because Arab men and women, surprising, right? Well, maybe it's not that surprising. Women too, they objected. There were actually protesting the inclusion of genealogy, the women's science in the curriculum. So you can see, right, that the movement has had to, be more a little bit, has had to take a different approach when it comes to those regions. And instead of imposing and saying no, we want you to teach genealogy, they kind of, okay, sure, let's not do it now, but let's help the Arab women themselves in those regions to develop similar mechanisms and similar practices. And I went to Raqqa, which was the de facto capital of ISIS caliphate, right, until it was defeated. And I met Arab women there. And they created a similar umbrella organization, similar to that of the Kurdish women. They said after our city, our province was liberated from ISIS, we're like, well, look what the Kurdish women are doing just north of us. Why can't we do it here? And so they set up, with the Kurdish women's support, this umbrella organization. They have similar mechanisms in place. Still not to the same degree, and the movement is helping them. The movement wants to see kind of these ideas, right? The movement wants to see a push from within, right? They don't think imposing will work in the long term, right? They rightfully they think it will just lead to a backlash.
Yeah. So, just to speak a little bit about education. So I I interviewed a lot of people for my thesis about the education system in Rojava. And I kind of just want to preface this a little bit by talking about diversity in this place. So we're talking a lot about the Kurds, but actually Kurdistan is very diverse. Kurdistan has a ton of Arab people, has a ton of Kurdish people. It also has Syriac and Assyrian people. There's a lot of, it's a very diverse space. And it also has some minorities and majorities even that have dealt with, very intense, I saw something, maybe it was a thumbs up. Anyways, very intense, they've dealt with very intense oppression. They've dealt with genocides. They've dealt with ethnic cleansing. I mean, you're talking about people who've dealt with colonial violence, state violence. It's incredible. They've people who've gone through fascism coming in with Daesh or the Islamic State coming in. And how do people kind of come out of this and come to this space? So I just wanted to preface that this movement, everything that comes from it, this is a movement from within this space. It's a movement of the Middle East. It's a movement of Kurdish people, but it's also has always been in conjunction with other people, Turkish people, Arabic people. I think is yes, and even more so today, because now there's this coexistence and commingling of Arabic and Kurdish cultures, and people are learning how to coexist and understand each other even when their cultures are different. And so, with that said, education. All right, so historically in Syria, roughly speaking, in Syrian Kurdistan, a lot of Kurdish people couldn't go to school. So in the 1960s, about 100 or 200,000 Kurdish people lost their citizenship in Syria. There was a census, a sort of like corrupt census that occurred, and they stripped a lot of people from getting citizenship rights. And as a result, people couldn't own property, they couldn't get like a passport to leave the country, they couldn't go to school. And sometimes it affected them being able to get health care. It was awful, and it still impacts people today. And so two of the people I spoke to were actually people who had no citizenship rights. And one of the two people just got their ID cards after 40 years. And historically, they had to either, use somebody else's ID card to go to school. And when they did go to school, they weren't allowed to speak Kurdish there. And Kurdish education just wasn't allowed. They couldn't even have a class on Kurdish. And there was this kind of tightening of control of the education system as a way to keep people out. I mean, you had generations of people who just never went to school because they weren't allowed to. They maybe didn't have the money or assets to be able to bribe their way in or get their way in some other way. And then you had people who went to school, and while they were there was this kind of aura of control, state top-down control. And so when the revolution occurred, one of the biggest and most important changes was the education system. It was saying, we need to have a system that's of the people. And so one of the first things they did was they started establishing Arabic and Kurdish schools. And so people were able to learn in their own language. And I think that in and of itself is really a revolutionary thing. Just being able to have multiple languages people can, read and understand and feel pride in their culture, because that's a way of continuing a culture rather than erasing a culture. In addition to that, they were able to set up new curriculums, talk about the revolution itself inside the school, and be able to have a political education for their students. And this is from the very youngest to the very oldest. So elementary schools, high schools, they all had this new format. They also developed, I think it's 3 colleges, universities in Rojava. And the universities offer everything. They specialize, for instance, in genealogy, which Anya was talking about a minute ago, which is women's studies, like radical, feminist, revolutionary studies. That's what genealogy is. Especially it's specifically, it's not just feminist studies, it's Middle Eastern feminist studies. It's very specifically looking at feminism from the perspective of someone who grew up in Kurdistan. Whether you're Kurdish, Arabic, doesn't matter. And They also have a ton of environmentalist courses because that's part of, the movement and what they want to build. And so that education system has harbored a whole generation of people who might not have even been able to go to school. And so, to me, when I talked to people about it, I was very curious to see how this education system, like what people thought of it. And so, with all that in mind, I want to just give a challenge to this system, which is that, the autonomous administration, it's the system of communes, basically, that run everything. And there's some representative central government too, but it's a mix of both, but it's a lot of communes and local organizations. And the thing is, when you are a regional government that acts independently of the state that you are in, you face certain challenges. And one of them is the challenge of legitimacy. So when you're a state, you get to have the kind of monopoly on legitimacy. So you can say, this healthcare system is legitimate according to the state. It's a public system. Or this school is a public school. And so when the revolution came and created their own schools for the community, the government went ahead and said, we do not acknowledge these schools' existence. We don't acknowledge the degrees. And so as a result, people who do get degrees from these schools face challenges getting jobs outside of the autonomous administration. So if they go to other parts of Syria, they might not recognize their degree. They might act as if they've never had any education. If they leave the country to immigrate or as a refugee, they might act as if they never had an education. And that's a real challenge. It's one people are trying to work on. They're trying to get people to recognize in other countries, their degrees that they, confer. But the thing is that I think it's important when we talk about these movements and what it means to actually be there for ourselves, whether it's Kurdish people being there for themselves, Arabic people, American people here, to actually think about what those challenges are and face them head on and recognize them, because they're not going to go away. So with that in mind, I think we want to talk.
Now we're to
the biggest challenge.
We got the depressive part of the
the biggest challenge
of the conversation. Yeah, so a lot of challenges. We want to focus on external challenges. We can talk about the internal ones after this. But Turkey, in one word, right? What's the biggest threat of Rojava? Yeah, boo. Yeah, everyone almost came to see Biden in DC. It was supposed to be yesterday. But luckily the Armenian community, which is pretty strong, they organized and spooked him. Well, one factor, right? Also some tensions clearly between the two leaders. But so the revolution, we can talk about the internal challenges as much as we want, but they can't address or they can't resolve the internal challenges unless the external challenges are removed. So as long as Turkey continues bombing that region and utilizing all other techniques to undermine it, it'll be very hard for them. And I'm soon people know, but again, I'm going to mention this. Turkey has invaded twice Rojava, once in 2018, second time in 2019. Turkey is now occupying two relatively big chunks of the territory, and they're maintaining a rule through these Syrian proxies, Syrian mercenaries, a rule that's comparable to that of ISIS. That's what people told who had to escape from these territories. Clearly an illegal occupation. Clearly the UN never said anything. But that's just one aspect, right? Turkey wants to invade again. Turkey wants to occupy more land. It cannot do it at the moment, right? There are too many interests involved. Turkey can't really take decisions unilaterally. There is also Russia that supports the Syrian government. There is the United States. We can talk about the role of the United States later. There's Iran. So it can't invade again. What it does, it just bombs the shit out of the region, right? And kills leaders, kills civilian, political, military leaders with its drones. When I was there last time, I went to a women's conference that was at the university. And there was one major commander, YPJ. We didn't talk about YPJ.
Oh, yeah.
The women only, right?
They have a whole armed forces that's just for women.
Women only, yeah.
So YPJ, and then they have the YPG, which
That's
is
mixed
which
gender,
mixed,
yeah,
which
right.
is mixed.
And so there was this one very important commander, well-known commander, YPJ commander, who spoke at the conference, talking about the challenges of the movement, etc. And then the next day, I come to the second day of the conference, and we all learned that she was killed by a drone by the Turkish state on the way out. And that was the same road that I took when I was going home with my friends. And so this is very tangible. Like, Turkey's attacks are in your everyday life, even if you're there just for a short amount of time, but they're very debilitating because Turkey knows, right? They have very good intelligence, so they target the best people. They target the people who are the most committed to the revolution, right? As this YPJ commander was, because she was crucial, right, for the development of the women's movement. So that's, it's a real drain on the revolutionary leadership. Turkey has maintained an embargo through its ally, the Kurdistan region of Iraq. The Kurds, there are different Kurds, right?
There's different groups of Kurds. There's the Kurdistan Regional Government of Iraq, and then there's the Autonomous Administration. They have different politics.
They're not all,
well, the Kurdistan Regional Government
they're not all
has
revolutionaries.
No, they're not all revolutionaries. That's the better way to put it. I wouldn't say good or bad. That wouldn't pass that kind of judgment. But they have different policies.
A lot of people in Rojava will say the Kurdistan Regional Government is bad. Just precisely, right? They're maintaining an embargo, right, on Rojava. They are preventing even Sorry? Right, they are preventing even the basic needs, the basic goods, food stuff, or medicine. They're preventing that from coming in, let alone kind of more sophisticated, right, industrial parts or
Anya, could I stop you for a minute? Just for those who aren't familiar, there's a divide and conquer strategy. So Kurdistan is broken up into 4 different places. That was intentionally done by imperialist forces a long time ago, in order so that Kurdistan would not be united. And so something that we see is that, there's terrible fighting between Kurdistan in Iraq and Kurdistan in Syria. And part of that has to do with the way different governments play both sides of that fight and play them against each other. So Kurdistan in Iraq is allies with Turkey. Yep. And so Turkey bombs Turkish Kurdistan, and they also bomb Syrian Kurdistan. And there's... we can go into it more in the discussion, but it's a very sad situation. It's like a long time, you could say, civil war of kinds. And it's very sad, and it has to do a lot with exploiting people. I think it also has to do with a level of ethnic cleansing as well. I don't know if you'd agree with that, but...
divide and rule, I think, encapsulates
Yeah, divide and
well.
rule,
Yeah. But in any case, and I didn't get a chance to talk about ecology, but for example, right, they want to build an ecological society. They still rely on oil to a big extent, right? For to meet people's need for electricity and fuel. They want to build a solar panel factory. Right? That's the big goal, right? How to start addressing the ecological challenges, but they can't bring the material. They can't bring the equipment that they would need because of this embargo, right? So it also just prevents them from reaching their very ambitious revolutionary goals. Turkey actually escalated its attacks last fall, right around when Israel started its round of war on Gaza,
which was probably intentional.
They may have realized that it will help them to stay under the radar of the international community. But what they have done, they've carried out several aerial bombardment campaigns since October last year, targeting specifically civilian infrastructure in Rojava.
Hello, I am Suad from Rojava.
I'm so sorry.
Well, now you know how to stop it, right?
I do know how to stop it. I'm sorry.
You got that.
All right.
Right, and so civilian infrastructure, meaning water stations, oil facilities, food factories, what else? There's some hospitals, schools, so we're really just trying to make people's lives uninhabitable.
Yeah, unlivable, basically.
Just to force them out. And that's what people say, right? We think Turkey cannot invade us right now. We think Turkey wants us to leave because it's unbearable. It becomes unbearable. You don't have electricity, you don't have water, you don't have enough access to medicine, etc. Right? All these factors add up, and people feel very demoralized. They don't see the light in the end of the tunnel. Right? Why have we suffered so much, and we don't see a good future in front of us? So this is about the impact, specifically about this recent Israel bombardment campaign.
All right, so I don't know how this is working because my audio is like deciding to be frustrating right now. So I might not be able to play this correctly, in which case I really apologize. But let me.
I mean, you can't get the video part of it?
I
Or
don't.
is it just audio?
Maybe the show all windows? I don't know.
No, I don't think so. I think for now, folks, maybe let's put a pause on it. I've been in so many events where there's technical difficulties, and it's just like 5 minutes of technical difficulties. I don't want to put people through that. So under the circumstances, in short, what she said was that they don't have power a lot of the times. They're having blackouts. And those blackouts have to do with the fact that there's bombings of energy sites, and there's deliberate destruction of things in order so that, in addition to embargoes, in order so that people do not have sufficient electricity for their regular functioning. And my friend, particularly who's here, she's a member of the Kurdish Red Crescent. She goes all across. She goes to the occupied section of Syrian Kurdistan. So there's occupied sections of Syria by Turkey. So she travels there and she meets with people because she works with this Red Crescent organization, which is like a health group. So she travels and tries to give people health care in Afrin, which is an occupied area. And so, in short, the challenge is when your external forces are trying to make your life uninhabitable, as best they can, what can you do? And so at ECR, one of our major goals is to try to get the United States to stop funding Turkey, stop selling weapons to Turkey. Because basically, the destruction of Rojava is happening, with the United States as weapons. They're made here. And they would be able to do something, but they would not be able to drone attack Rojava the way they're drone attacking Rojava without United States F-16s. Isn't that what they're called?
Right, those are the fighter jets.
The fighter jets.
Also used by Israel. I mean, it's really...
These are connected causes.
Part of the same imperial project.
They just wouldn't be able to. And so that's a huge deal for us, is trying to get the United States to stop selling these arms. Because without these kind of imperialist arms, it would be a much better situation.
Yeah, I mean, there are other ways, right, in which the U.S. is complicit in this war of Turkey, right? How did the invasion of 2018 happen? You all remember, right? Trump loudly said, yes, it's fine for Turkey to invade, right? So, the United States has a voice, right? What happens in that region. As I mentioned, like, Turkey would not be... Huh? Yes. There are U.S. troops in Rojava, right? That doesn't mean that just by virtue of having troops, an invasion won't happen, right? What Trump did, he declared that he would withdraw the troops. They actually didn't withdraw. There are still 700 troops. They just moved a little bit down south. In the meantime, Turkey was free to come in, and occupy the land, right? With the U.S. troops a little bit further down south, right? Like all these drone attacks, all the attacks with the fighter jets. It's all in the same area where you have U.S. troops, right? So it's clearly there is coordination. Clearly there is an implicit permission by the United States government for these attacks and these invasions to take place. So that's, as you said, one of our missions. We know that by virtue of being constituents, we have some leverage, right, with our supposed representatives. And so, one of the things we ask people to do, tell your friends about Rojava, right, get people excited about, want to learn about it, but also we do phone banks. We prepare scripts for people to, kind of similar thing, right, that people are doing right now for Palestine, right? Call your representatives and say, we don't like it. Right, we're not going to elect you again. Stop supporting, stop being complicit in Turkey's war on Kurds in the war on Rojava. So
Yeah. So I think that's it for our presentation. We're just down to talk with people and like answer questions and yeah.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, and not just questions. People should be feel free to say
convert
reflections and.
So sorry.
Yeah, Ray.
Yeah, I was wondering if you guys, you mentioned it briefly, but I was wondering if you guys could expand a little more on like what social ecology is, how it plays a role in the revolution, and like how it's different from like say like typical like liberal environmentalism.
Do you want to just repeat the question? Can I repeat it really quick?
Oh yeah, of course.
Yeah. So the question was, can we expand a little bit about social ecology and how it's different from liberal environmentalism? Is that correct?
Yeah, basically.
Okay. Cool. You
want
want to
me
talk?
to take it?
You want to take it?
Yeah. I mean, the main idea, right, of social ecology and the Rojava's ideas about ecology do come from Bakhtin, pretty much. And the central idea is that ecological crisis is a social crisis, right? Ecological, the domination of nature is connected to domination of people, by other people, right? Of certain social groups, by other certain groups of women and men, etc. Right? So in order to solve an ecological, the environmental catastrophe that we are facing, you basically have to transform your society by removing all kinds of domination, right? You can't just solve, you can't just address the environment and the impact that our actions have on it. You have to also democratize politics, right? You have to give women their full rights, right? You have to democratize the economy. So all kinds of oppression and domination have to be removed, right, in order for domination of nature, right, to stop. And then in terms of how it works in practice in Rojava, so as you mentioned, right, about the university education system incorporating, right, ecology-related courses. They actually trying to set up a graduate program, a social ecology graduate program, which is, where else? I don't know. I haven't done research, but do we know any other university that has a social ecology inspired by Bakhtin, right? To meet the first challenge. And the first challenge for this region is that people are just not aware of what ecology is. People don't think about environmental crisis really in their everyday lives because it was never a topic before the revolution. There was very little political organizing allowed by the Syrian regime. Really, you could only have been political if you were organizing through the regime's institutions. Be in line with the regime's, party politics. And so there was no organizing about it in terms of environment. So people just don't know what it is. Like, they don't see why they should care. And really the first step was to raise consciousness. That's what the movement members, activists who work with environmental issues, that's what they have been focusing on. So they, for example, one big project, they have been setting up ecology committees across all schools. So they want children, right, to be exposed to these ideas and to get involved in some kind of on the ground, like planting trees and stuff. And I know it sounds like inadequate, right? Is that enough to? Especially in that region, while they're also using oil, but it's really the first step to get people on board, in order to implement larger kind of structural changes.
Yeah. The other thing I wanted, if I could, just for the liberal element and social ecology versus liberal kind of environmentalism. So something that's practiced in most liberal countries around the world is this kind of like large scale agriculture where like it's like very large kind of, it's almost like centrally planned large farms, which then get like shipped to other places and then given to people in a very kind of separated way. And so I want to just speak for a moment about the history of Rojava and how it was monocropped.
Yeah.
So Rojava is one of the most fertile parts of Syria. And historically, like parts of Rojava, they weren't even allowed to grow anything but wheat. And so
Wheat and cotton,
yeah. And so as a result, you had this horrible kind of monocropping. And I think that is a liberal dynamic. And so part of the change has been creating diversity within the land and trying to bring back other kinds of seeds. And so that's been a big movement right now in Rojava, is how can we have diverse agriculture
Right.
rather than these kind of large agricultural businesses.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you.
You mentioned like right at the beginning that like organizers over there are like actively seeking out connection to international comrades and looking for that solidarity, and I'm wondering if you could say more about that and what that looks like, and what, like, I don't know, like if there's like political or material support that is particularly meaningful.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked me that question because we do want to talk about that. So just to give you like, some examples from our previous work or like our current work, we have organized several events with cooperatives, worker co-ops in Rojava, kind of encounters between organizers there on the ground and organizers here, like cooperative, Cooperation Jackson was part of it, for example. We have organized several meetings with the trade unions there. That's one aspect of organizing that they're pursuing that we didn't get into. But you know, they're trying to organize people also through their workplaces. So we've done that. We will have an event with the United States United States Confederation of Workers Cooperatives, right? Did I get that right? Yeah, we are organizing an event with them. So again, it will become a dialogue between the Rojava organizers and some of the worker cooperatives that are part of this confederation. They'll be public. Follow us on our social media. It's Defend Rojava, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. So that should be exciting. So they actually come up with this term, civil diplomacy, or is it? Yeah, civil diplomacy. Meaning they want to build grassroots relationships, like they want to build diplomatic relationships not with the governments, which they also do, they have to do, right? The United States government, for example, and other governments, just because they need to survive in this geopolitical conjuncture, but they also want to be connected with the groups that do similar work. So like women's groups, cooperatives, ecology-related stuff, just you name it, right? Whatever aspect of organizing they're engaged in, they would welcome a chance to engage in a dialogue. And we've done both private events, private conversations, and public conversations. And in terms of material help, it's not that easy really to get material help in there,
It's
right?
very difficult to send money or send anything there.
You can always donate to the Kurdish Crescent. They're really the only humanitarian organization.
And even, I mean, it's good to donate them, but even just to realize that, like, part of their stuff gets stolen.
Yeah.
It's not to say don't donate to them.
Right.
Please donate to them.
But logistically, it's very complicated.
Yeah.
But what they want, they want legitimacy, right? They want sort of recognition. They want to be visible so that we can also then, so that we have a base, a support base, especially here in the United States, through which we can put pressure on the U.S. government, right, and make it more difficult for Turkey. So that's the goal. So it's really, more kind of that type of solidarity than material aid that they're seeking.
Yeah, if I could just briefly add on to it, and I'm sorry, I'll take another. Just also, they do have people who do, like Anya. I actually also would love to go there. There are people who go there in person, which is very challenging to do, and there are people who actually volunteer there. That is part of this as well. And part of it is when you have an oppressed space, your borders are controlled. So just even having to people be able to go and visit is a political action. And so some aspect of it, perhaps not the main thing they're doing, is the people who volunteer and visit there in different capacities and communes. So anyways, yes. Did you have a...
Me?
Yeah.
Cora,
I've been thinking that
Oh.
I'm sorry, I think Cora.
I was just going to say, having been a solidarity activist in this space for a little while, one thing that is requested, of course, is that we make revolution here.
Yeah.
That is the best thing we can do for Rojava. And
Right.
one way, and unfortunately, they've created this incredibly rich revolution that we can use to talk about revolutionary ideas.
Yeah.
I've done a lot of talks about different aspects of the women's revolution, or about culture, because there's amazing cultural cultural stuff happening, about media, and all this, and we can use these things to talk about the essential thing here, which is freedom, you know, and so I think like everyone can do that. All you have to do is become familiar, you can watch films, you can, you know, I talk about it with my, like, you know, my 88-year-old aunt, you know, the idea of a women's revolution to her is just like an incredible idea, and so, you know, just, you know, everyone can everyone can talk about Rojava, and that's a thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely, and I'm glad you mentioned, right, sort of, it's really a two-way street the way they see this solidarity, because they don't just want us to learn from them, they actually want to learn, because a lot of these ideas, they're trying to implement them for the first time. For example, with worker cooperatives, they went through several setbacks because they just never done this before. They didn't know how to, set this up so that it works. Like there was one example where, and we didn't talk about that either, but it's an important aspect of the revolution, right? The fact that they're trying to democratize economy by setting up worker cooperatives. And they kind of have institutional support for this. So there was a lot. The state, the Syrian regime, was the biggest landowner, right, landholder before the revolution. And so now, since there is no Syrian state, the autonomous administration, right, the movement has that land, and they've set up a good amount of it specifically to support people who want to open worker co-ops. So a lot of the economy is really centered on agriculture, so there are a lot of agricultural cooperatives, but there's one amusing case when a group of people applied and they got this land and other resources that come with it, and then they went and they hired some other people to work the land.
Oh
So
dear.
they just didn't get the idea of worker-owned, worker-managed, worker-worked cooperative, and so they they've kind of been operating, learning from their own mistakes. And there's a lot for them to learn from folks here who've been doing this for years, for decades.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you have your hand up.
I'm curious to learn more about what the moment of rupture, like when the Syrian soldiers withdrew and there was this power vacuum, how the autonomous administration managed to form out of that, and what that looked like and how it was accomplished and what kind of challenges.
So, Anya, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it was a lot of the youth cooperatives who were involved at that time. Am I remembering this right?
I mean, youth were involved, but there were other
ones as well.
I mean, the main thing. Do you want to start?
Well, you can talk. We can both.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, we think, right? We have had these conversations a lot in our group, but we think what was important for them to be able to, take advantage of that power vacuum was the fact that the movement, the PKK movement, had been organizing there for
decades.
Since the 80s.
Yeah.
Right? Since the 80s, clandestinely, they had to do it underground, but they were. So they had this clandestine network of activists, of people who were getting educated and who were taking on various roles within the movement. And so by the time the revolution, by the time the Syrian civil war started, they kind of had this infrastructure there, right? They had the skills. Also important to know, this is the movement that emerged in Turkey. It's also a movement that, was able to do similar things in Turkey, right before they started organizing in Syria. So in Turkey, they've been organizing through similar lines, right? It's a different situation because the Turkish state is there and it's quite oppressive, but still they started organizing there in 2005, right? They tried to set up communes there too. They did set up communes. They got crushed in the war, when Turkey started attacking Kurdish cities, Kurdish areas in Turkey.
It destroyed all of
2015. But the fact is that the movement was setting up those structures, and they already kind of saw what works, what doesn't work. They also just very good at mobilizing people and recruiting people and getting people involved. So they have they have a big support base in Turkey, less so in Syria, but still there was enough for them to kind of come out as the most powerful, if I can use that word, actor, right?
Most
And-
organized actor,
right,
I would
most
say.
most organized actor, right?
Yeah.
They had the know-how and the skills and experience of doing that.
Yeah, and the thing is, like, they already had, not all of the communes, but they had a percentage of those communes already existed. And so what you see is, you see people saying, like, wow, well, we already have this theory of what we could have as a society. We already have communes here. Why can't we connect the communes together and create our own government? And I think what that looked like in the beginning, as Anya stated, the PKK absolutely had an influence, and also the local parties in Syria. But I think the biggest thing was, it's almost this kind of dual power dynamic where, like, there was already organization when the state was there. And when the state left, it made sense because they already knew how to take care of their own community. And therefore they could empower and expand what they were already doing.
Yeah. And speaking to what Cora said, right? Like, what can you do to support Rojava? Well, organize here. But, there are actually ways to, organize along similar lines, right? You don't need to wait for that rupture moment, right? For the state to collapse or, to disintegrate. Because the Kurdish movement has been organizing under different circumstances, including with the state being present, right? I mean, we can talk about how successful that has been, but they have been doing this nonetheless, despite all the oppression.
Yeah, and the other thing I want to say, well, we think the Rojava Revolution is interesting because it was one of those revolutions which wasn't a very bloody revolution. And
minus ISIS, right?
Oh, well, obviously, and also Turkey. It was very bloody in Turkey. So actually, you know what? When I take back what I say, it was an extremely bloody revolution. But it gets to a dynamic. Someone here was talking about in the comments about Turkey. I can't even read it, but I think it says, yeah, they tried to create demographic change in Kurdish areas. So in some ways, there was an ability to switch governments mostly peacefully in lots of Rojava, not all of Rojava. But in other parts there was the terrible violence. In Turkey there's punishing Kurds for what's happening in Syria.
Punishment,
But one of the things I remember reading about was that in certain areas it was really, people already had communities and they started putting up flags. And that was how they started taking over, and it went town by town.
So you actually kind of just spoke to this, but there were some towns in which flags went up, and you were talking a little bit about how there's kind of environment of media criticism growing. And I know that in the early years of the Syrian civil war, there was a film collective called Abu Nadar that grew up largely, I think, in the western part of Syria. But is there what is the best way to access the kind of artistic or critical environment that interact with that? Is there a way to do that for people that aren't in the region? Because I find that it's easiest to kind of talk about and spread these ideas in an environment that's not that, when you can talk about the symbols and talk about the art and the criticism that's going on in those environments.
Annie, you want me to take this? I know something about the film collectives.
Yeah, go.
So there's film cooperatives and collectives in Rojava. I can't think of, there's a big one in
Rojava Film Collective.
Oh, okay. All right, so simple.
Commune.
Rojava Film Commune,
yeah.
And there's many like it. They're pretty Googleable in that sense. And I think they have film festivals too through the universities. Am I wrong about this? I think so. So you absolutely can.
And we've shown some of their films.
Yeah. Through ECR is a great way. Rojava
you can find them on YouTube usually. Yeah.
Rojava Information Center is also a great place to just connect to different things that are occurring in Rojava, whether that's films that are being made, what art and in the art scene. Personally, for me, I'm friends with a filmmaker in Rojava who's so talented and young. He's such a cool person. I found that there's a really cool art scene, honestly. I think really, really creative, wonderful, cooperative, communal art scene. Yeah.
Yeah, it's exciting. Yeah, if you want suggestions for movies that you could show, spaces like this we can,
Yeah.
Yeah.
give those.
That'd be awesome.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, I've had, like, there's a million questions buzzing in my head. I'll try to just go with, like, a short one. This is the first one that came up in my head. So you mentioned that, that the society is still kind of grappling with social conservatism and sort of the differences in ethnic backgrounds. You also mentioned you were teaching at a university. I'm wondering now that it's been maybe, 10 to 13 years, and there are kids who have, I imagine, have grown up in this revolutionary society. Do you see some of those, social norms changing in the youth? And is that localized? Is it widespread? Or maybe you can speak to that.
Yeah, I've definitely seen that, especially when it comes to gender issues. Again, probably because it's just the most successful aspect of the revolution, or maybe it's because women constitute half of the population, right? So they're kind of all for it. But yeah, like you can see the difference, right, when you talk to older women, for example, who are in the movement, like old timers who, for example, run these women's houses versus younger women, who just got politicized, who were in college or in high school when the revolution started. And you can see there is a gap, right? These younger women, their horizon is much wider than how these older women envisage women's liberation. For example, older women, they still want to keep the family as the form, right? The only form, the marriage, right? As the only form of relationship. And younger women, my friends would tell me, we want to take this revolution further. Like, we know that the society is not there, but that's no longer works for us. That's not how we. So you definitely see that. But then, like, whether it's localized, right? Of course, there's big difference between the Kurdish regions when the revolution started in 2000. Pretty much, right, 2011, 2012, versus the Arab majority regions that were liberated much later. Was it 2017 till 2019 when the dictatorial defeat of ISIS took place, and so there the revolution is very young, right? And, so it's.
So you said, where is it young? In the
Arab majority
in the Arab
areas,
majority
yeah.
places.
Yeah.
They were liberated from ISIS later.
I've seen significant significant differences between the older people and the younger people. Of course, there's always the older people who inspired the younger, inspired this movement, were part of this movement. But, for the people who are kind of emerging in this movement, who weren't, directly part of its founding, my experience, the people I talked to who were younger were very, very into it. And some of the older people were like, they were open to it. They were, okay with it, had not really negative things to say, but they weren't necessarily passionate about it. And God, I forgot what I was going to say, but it was some kind of answer to your question about this.
Okay. Yeah.
But
if
we want to be really honest, there is also what I found and was so striking.
Oh, I remembered.
But it was the fascination that like really young kids have with sort of Western media content that they get hold of through their phones, and that's a new thing, right? Just the accessibility, and unfortunately, it's very appealing. Despite the fact that there is a revolution happening and these kids have been educated into these completely new ideas, they're on TikTok. I've seen young, teenagers just, following your regular bullshit, right? I know TikTok has been great for other things, but that's what the algorithm sends to these kids in Syria, right? And I don't know how they're gonna struggle with this, and they're not unique, right? The Zapatistas, right? If you go to Chiapas, they're experiencing similar problem. There is such an appeal that this American dream has on the younger generation. So it's double-edged sword.
So I remember what I wanted to say, but I also see this person is raising their hand, so I can hold that thought. What's your question?
Okay, so I got here a little bit late, so I apologize if this was covered, but I wanted you to say more about like the specificities of U.S. imperialism there. Like, are there specific demands about like ending certain weapon like a lot of other places there's like specific, we want this military base out, or we want this sort of specific thing. So I'm just wondering if there's like concrete demands around U.S. imperialism.
Yeah, I think the F-16s is probably.
Well, yeah, we had sort of low-key campaign. Unfortunately, we had to compete, with all the organizing for Palestine to prevent another sale of fighter jets to Turkey by the United States. It did go through. Unfortunately, we don't have a strong enough basis, to prevent things like that. But we are pretty sure there will be more sales in the future. And one interesting fact about this recent sale was that Turkey got it because it agreed to lift its objection for Sweden to join NATO. So it was very openly, just behind the scenes deal. You do us a favor, we'll do you a favor. So pretty sure more favors, right? Turkey has been an important strategic ally of the United States since the Cold War, and it's not gonna, things are not gonna change anytime soon. But beyond, preventing any sales of weapons or any other sort of aid or getting the United States to sanction Turkey, right, for its war crimes in Rojava. Beyond that, we also try to talk about the fact that U.S. military presence in Syria is not really it's not doing what it's supposed to do, right? I mean, it is sort of a guarantee that the Turkey can't unilaterally invade, but it's not a 100% guarantee, right? I just mentioned the 2019 invasion did happen with the U.S. troops being just miles away. So military presence is not really the solution, right? Not a recipe for safety. What the movement on the ground, what the Thomas administration is asking for, actually is diplomatic recognition, political recognition, to make it more difficult, both for Turkey and for the Syrian regime, because the Syrian regime is just waiting for an appropriate moment to take over, right? And so that's really the kind of long-term goal and the kind of long-term solution.
We had a question in the comments, which was basically the similar kind of question, which was, do we think it's possible for Rojava, for the autonomous administration, to receive, official diplomatic recognition?
They got it from Catalonia.
Oh, that's cool. Of course they did. And I guess the thing I wanted to speak to on that was that the kind of way that the autonomous administration has been existing, I give them a lot of credit. They have a lot of shit to deal with, and they have been existing under very hard circumstances. Even when the army left, it was still really hard circumstances. And I feel that the biggest challenge is getting that recognition, honestly. And I think that they've been kind of in this space now, even before the existence of the autonomous administration, going back longer into their history, where they've had to take on these kind of cocktail of allies and just do whatever they could to survive. And I think what we'd like to see at ECR is a space where they're recognized diplomatically, and they don't have to have U.S. troops there.
Rely on imperial power.
Yeah, they don't have to rely on an imperial power for safety. There can be diplomatic solutions to this rather than military solutions.
And by the way, I should clarify that they're not seeking recognition as a state, as an independent state, right?
Yeah.
They're very clear about this. They want to remain part of Syria. They just have a different vision for Syria compared to Assad. They want this to have some sort of federated structure, right?
Mm-hmm.
As hopefully the post-Civil War solution, if it ever comes.
Yes?
What was the acronym, ECR?
Oh, Emergency Committee for Rojava.
Awesome.
And I wanted to speak to something I remembered before, which is that, we've been speaking about conservatism in Syria, and I wanted to speak just a moment on how conservatism develops also, and how there have been a lot of authoritarian governments throughout Syria in the last 100 years. Both imperialist governments, authoritarianism within the Syrian government, authoritarianism through proxy armies that have come in, and that has a real impact on people. That has an impact on how people view gender roles. That has an impact on how people view themselves and what they feel that they can achieve and their limitations. And that when we think about this feminist revolution and all these things that are happening, these are all responses to authoritarianism around them. It's responses to other things too, but that should be part of the equation. And it's not so much a group of people who are like, oh, we're progressing in this direction, but rather it's people fighting for liberation and responding to very, very oppressive structures. And I just wanted to make that clear, and especially in the liberated zones, what we talk about, a lot of the Arab majority liberated zones, and also parts of Rojava, which have experienced a lot of immigration from non-Kurdish people because they're safer places to live. That you're talking about people who have been under, this very strict, very violent regime of Daesh, the Islamic State, and also under different authoritarian and militias that have come through who were very violent. And the kind of rigid structures and laws that were put in place that they had to put up with, that has a psychological impact on people. And it's interesting in Rojava because Rojava is a place that believes in restorative justice, and yet they do have prisons.
Oh yeah, we didn't talk about that yet.
They have actually pretty large prisons. And the thing about Rojava's prisons is that the main people who are in the prisons are the international volunteers to ISIS. And I remember hearing once an interview about this, and people were saying that, when Daesh came in and they took over all these areas of Rojava and Syria, a lot of people, they didn't have much, there was resistance. It wasn't like there wasn't, but this was a very kind of oppressive structure that took over, and it was very difficult for people. And for locals who were able to be liberated from that space, many local people, even who took part in the government of Daesh, incorporated into this like newly freed kind of system where they have more democratic control. But the people who came from other countries didn't. And
there are some,
some who did.
Right, some kind of local ISIS members.
Oh
who
yeah.
are Still,
Then they're
still in prisons,
Yeah.
But there, as you mentioned, the restorative justice principle, right? So they actually have released a lot of Syrians, as you said, like locals who were involved with ISIS, to various degrees. They've released a lot of those who they didn't consider, dangerous to their communities. So they set up deals with their local communities, right? In Arab regions, it is done through tribal structures, but it's sort of the kind of placed responsibility on those people's communities to make sure, right, that they rehabilitate and they do not re-engage with ISIS-like activities. So there is an attempt, right, to kind of find other alternative solutions to imprisonment. But right, as you said, the internationals, right, they do not want to take care of thousands of people from all around the world who came to kill them, right? But they also just cannot send them back. There is no way. So they are forced to maintain these facilities.
So they have a lot of these prisons. They're kind of like, I don't know what I'd call them. They're almost like little, I don't know. It's of a lot of these international people, and also internally displaced people who are sometimes there and then leave.
There are some displaced folks that have to
kind of like refugee camps almost.
Yeah. Like section.
Yeah, kind of like that.
But the point is, that's another challenge that we didn't talk about. That Rojava actually needs help dealing with all these people, and they've been making demands to the international community, saying that all these countries from where this young men or old men
and women,
or women
right,
came
too.
Women came to us to kill us, you should repatriate them and put them on trial, right? And very few countries have been doing that, and the West
Like, it's
has
your
like
problem.
the worst. The Western countries, Europe, United States have the worst record. And why is it dangerous? It's actually dangerous because if these people break out of their prisons, there you'll see a resurgence of ISIS pretty quickly, right? And they try to do, yeah, exactly. They're just waiting for the moment. And Turkey has bombed those prisons, clearly with an intention to facilitate such a prison outbreak. And if there is another invasion of Turkey, that's a concern for the whole world. It's not just a concern for people in Rojava. That ISIS will get out and they will regroup. And who's going to deal with them?
Yeah.
So I know that earlier you mentioned that the feminism that is being taught in schools is very Middle Eastern centric. And then later you talked about how the gender roles are incredibly binary. I was a bit curious how, I guess trans and queer and gay topics are handled under this incredibly binary structure.
Yeah.
I didn't
Do you
talk
have
to
things
any
in-
queer people in
Yeah.
Rojava, so
Okay.
if you have more insight on it, I'll defer to you.
Yeah. I have actually have a couple of friends who are queer and in Kamishlo. And it's not talked about. It's still a social taboo. And if you talk to the movement, sometimes you'll hear, well, we know that our society is not accepting. We're trying not to push it too far. Trying to, take things gradually. And, you can, of course, interpret that as an excuse, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because they could have used the same argument with women. Right?
Yeah, you could
They
have.
did push for women's liberation. So in a way, that's a shortcoming with the movement. That there are not enough people in the movement that are kind of willing to push that agenda from within the movement and then take it to the broader society. But there are queer people. They have to hide that. I mean, it's culturally, society is more tolerable. Men, right? Who are queer versus for lesbians, it's a little bit more difficult. But unfortunately, there is no solution. We know that there are conversations happening within the movement, and those conversations are being kind of forced or kind of emerge out of the dialogues, out of the interactions with internationalists.
Yeah.
So there is a
Sorry.
Yeah.
So there is a hope that out of these interactions, right, this issue will gain more space within the movement, within the discourse, and more acceptance. Yeah.
Yeah, and that was my impression as well. Unfortunately, I didn't have the chance to talk to queer people in Rojava, but from my reading and research, the impression I got was that there, when you have a liberatory revolutionary movement and you have volunteers, you're going to end up with a bunch of queer volunteers because a lot of queer people tend to volunteer.
Yeah.
So that's been something that's been happening where there have been queer people who have come to Rojava. And from what I know, they've been treated pretty well. However, I get the feeling that they're, and I don't want to speak too much because I don't want to impose any kind of belief that I don't really understand, but I tend to agree with Anya that there is work that needs to be done there and that there's some kind of discrimination that's happening and that's something that they really need to work on.
Right. But then another positive thing and thing that gives one hope in this issue is that this movement, the Kurdish movement, is really transnational. They're not just based in Syria and Turkey. And in fact, speaking of Turkey, they've embraced the LGBTQI agenda, right? The Kurdish party in Turkey, right? They do engage
The
in electoral
HDP or the
politics.
PKK?
The HDP,
Okay.
the electoral, right? The
Oh, that's
electoral
cool.
part of the movement. It's been on their electoral agenda for years now, so they're pretty open, and they, did get to a point where the Kurdish society of Turkey was ready to engage with those ideas. Yeah.
Yeah, so you mentioned that Bookchin and communalism were really big influences and kind of building blocks for Rojava society. I was wondering what other philosophers or thinkers or ideologies also, if there were any others that were a big influence.
Yeah. Well, one kind of school of thought that Öcalan was reading is world systems analysis. So Wallerstein and Brodel, and like his analysis of capitalism. Is it influenced by their ideas and sort of what an anti-capitalist economy would look like?
We're gonna have some more artwork tomorrow. Whoever's gonna be, we got artwork. We're going on a field trip to the Bear Beach. Whoever wants to come can come. If you don't want to come, then
Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you.
Cheeseburger. Take it easy.
Right, so for example, from Brodel, he took the idea that markets in themselves are not evil, right? Or not, like capitalism is not defined by markets, so like they're not trying to eliminate markets or private, small private property. They're trying to prevent monopoly, as they frame it. Try to, prevent big businesses from emerging. They had slow, little progress on that, but that's the idea. What other? Foucault. Yeah, of course, yeah. Would you like to?
Well, Maria Mises, there's about really, Öcalan's writing about the housewifeification, the way, the centrality of women's oppression and women as the revolutionary subject, and these.
Also, goddess theory is so strong inside Rojava. For better and worse, it is very strong. For those of you who do not know what goddess theory is, it's the idea that originally gods were female and they became male over time. And it is, it's definitely in the movement. And I think it informs a lot of very positive outcomes for how people think about each other and how their openness to thinking about gender equality and what gender is. And I also think there's some very genuine criticisms of goddess theory.
Yeah, but that was the spirit in the 80s when all these feminists were writing. Yeah. By the way, I think it's been almost 2 hours and some people will have to leave, but we have some of our literature. I think behind Hazel we have some.
There's a table in the back.
Yeah, there's a table in the back, and please, if you want to get news updates about Rojava, if you want to get involved, we have a sign-up sheet. You can leave your email and or WhatsApp. We have a WhatsApp group. Follow us on social media. As I said, it's Defend Rojava across all the platforms, and we'd love you to stay in touch.
So just wanted to recommend Arthur Pye's article on Strange Matters. It's really a very deep and beautiful writing, and there'll be a lot more from him.
Yeah.
So it's strangeMatters.co.
Yeah, I also want to say I live in Boston, so if anyone's interested in Boston Kurdish stuff, just come to me because I live here. And yeah, that's it. You can talk to me afterwards and get my contact information. Oh, we have a further question. One last one.
We can stay. I just wanted to make sure that people sign up before they leave.
Oh, did people sign
those people who want to leave early.
Do we have a sign-up sheet?
It's in the back.
Okay, so did everyone sign the sign-up sheet? Okay, it's there.
I was wondering, there's some people asking questions in Zoom too.
Oh, yeah. I think I've answered some of them.
Okay, sure.
What was the article just mentioned? What was that, for anyone?
Arthur Pye, Strange Matters.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can bring it up.
Arthur's also doing the West
Yeah.
Coast part.
How do you spell Pye?
P-Y-E.
Oh, I said
Like
Arthur
like
Pye.
And
Okay.
also the social contract rather.
Yeah.
Really worth reading, and you can get that Peace in Kurdistan website. Has
Yes.
a lot of the basic documents.
Is that
Yeah.
Kurdistan?
Kurdish. You mean peace? There's also Kurdish Peace Institute.
I saw the social contract on the Rojava Information Center. It's
Yep.
probably on all of them, right?
Yeah.
All right, so I want to, for those of you who need to go, it's fine. We had one more question. Kevin?
Yeah.
And 2 more in the back.
Oh,
here.
and we have some on chat as well. Listen, I'm here.
In your meetings with various Kurdish groups, have you encountered the subject of the 1948 Declaration of Human Rights among your Kurdish audiences?
No, I have not. I have not told, but if you read the social contract, you can see that they kind of try to
It's incorporated in there.
right incorporate all this like international.
The social contract
human
is
rights
is the
standards.
constitution of Rojava, and the constitution of Rojava does incorporate it. So if you read the social contract, I haven't also not heard people talk openly about it. However, like I think one of the first lines of the social contract is, what is it exactly? I forget exactly the terminology, but it's we comply with all human rights laws according to the United Nations and all declarations. That's one of the first lines in their constitution, and it's incorporated into how they view people in their society within their own constitution. And so it's definitely there. However, in my experience, the United Nations as a framework is perhaps an underdeveloped, in my experience with research, relationship between Rojava and negotiations with their neighbors and with the state. I know that they've been trying to develop it more, and it's been challenging because they have trouble being recognized. And I also know that Rojava in particular and the Kurdish people have been involved with the, the Council for Indigenous People. I forget what it's called in the United Nations. There's the meeting of indigenous peoples. They're involved with that. So.
One of you, either of you, yeah.
So you touched on it earlier, but I was wondering, like, what's the approach to criminal justice? Because I know, like, the approach to civil matters is more like restorative justice. What's the approach to criminal?
Yeah, so those cases are still the preview of like this court system that they have inherited. I'm not sure. I mean, the people with whom I talk to, right? So the way they envision, the transformation of justice system is to eventually make courts and prisons unnecessary. So that's their goal, right? I don't know if they'll get there at some point, but like it's kind of like we're starting with the civil matters. We are sort of teaching people to, know how to deal with these affairs by themselves without state institutions. But at the same time, as you can see, there's a lot of cases do go through the traditional conventional court system. So I actually don't know how it's going to work out in the future. They also don't want prisons, right? They want to turn them obsolete. They want to make them into education centers. That's what they say. There have been some attempts to do that.
Yeah.
One big reason, there's different factors what's preventing them. First of all, they just don't have enough resources. They don't have enough personnel. I actually visited a rehabilitation center for ISIS teenagers, so the people who used to be trained by ISIS to fight, and some of them actually fought. And the Trump's administration has set up 2 rehabilitation centers for these kids. They don't have resources to incorporate all the kids that they have in detention, but they're trying. They're with these little steps, and it's if you go there, you can see it was very eerie. Just to think that these kids were killing, right on the front lines. But you can see that they're really doing it with the genuine intent of rehabilitating and just preparing them for a different life. As we discussed, the question whether they'll have an opportunity to have a different life is uncertain because
there's a lack of opportunity around.
Most of these kids are internationals, and so it will be difficult for them to stay in this.
As an
society.
international,
they have to, the administration wants them to go home with this new.
Wouldn't you also say, Anya, there is opportunity if you're in Rojava and you don't. The system does not prevent anyone from working or living there, regardless of nationality. However,
but these are teenagers, right?
It's tough.
Who were brainwashed by ISIS, so you can't just let them out in the society. You need to set up mechanisms, right, to monitor it, to make sure there's no relapse and they don't have resources for that. Yeah, there is a an attempt, at least there's an intent.
We had a question in the chat about whether or not we could be able to. Afrin is one of the occupied territories in Turkish-occupied regions in Syrian Kurdistan and Syria, and we had a question about whether, like, how possible we see it is to sort of push Turkey out of that space and out of occupying that space.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about Afrin?
Yeah, I mean, I can just briefly speak on what I know.
And then we have one more, right?
Yeah.
You want us to get it now? Okay, yeah, let's get the other question too.
Yeah, I actually had less of a question, more of a comment. I really appreciate the way that you had explained how, like the roots of that conservatism that you mentioned, and how you explained how authority structures and particularly the regimes of the past affect you guys how they've engendered this kind of conservatism and this kind of fascism and reactionary outlook in certain people and certain conditions, because it's I find that even amongst well-intentioned folks on the left, sometimes it's really easy for folks to enter into this kind of Eurocentric kind of infantilization of Middle Eastern people and thinking that concepts of liberation, of queer liberation, or feminism, or what have you, is something new to people, or something that is only just being developed. And I really appreciate the way you explained it.
Thank you. Yeah, that's something that's very important to me as well. I think that, for Kurdish people, a trouble has been that these cocktail of allies they've had to have over the years and so much divide and conquer. I think there's sometimes I've noticed this in myself, there's, I think, a way in which there becomes these sometimes Cold War dynamics and also these maybe even anti-Arab or anti-Middle Eastern ideas, and somehow the Kurds are better, or somehow they're more Western, and I think that that's terribly inaccurate, and I think it's a way sometimes of people from different cultures, especially Western imperial cultures and non-Western cultures, to interact with each other. And I also think it's possible that sometimes in the hope of making allies, sometimes the narrative gets a little skewed, and I think that's unfortunate, because these people need to be given really a sense of respect, autonomy, no matter where they're from, what their ethnicity is. It just doesn't matter. And anyway, so that's something I'm very passionate about. And when I talk about, I with a lot of pride, I talk about Kurdistan and its many diverse peoples and how they interact and how they've developed responses to authoritarianism, and how I, as a Westerner, can learn from them, and how that's inspirational to me.
The Afrin question?
Oh yeah, the Afrin question. So, Afrin, poor Afrin. It's such a sad situation. I mean, for me, I feel that, I know that the autonomous administration is still trying to, from the inside out, be able to continue their cooperatives and communes in Afrin. No?
It's done.
It's done completely? I thought there were still some organizations that they're trying to, but it's more clandestine at this point.
I mean, yeah, it's really clandestine.
It's underground.
Yeah, and Kurds usually prefer to leave, yeah.
Right.
Like the Kurds who are connected to the movement.
Yeah.
Because they face the persecution, right? There are Kurds who don't support the movement, and it's safer for them to stay. But yeah, no, and Afrin was the most successful region of of Rojava when it got invaded, so they really lost a lot there, a lot of achievements. Yeah, I mean, it's just international pressure.
Yeah.
Yeah, they cannot do anything on their own. They can't keep Turkey out with the forces that they have. It has to come from international community.
Yeah, I can't disagree with you. I have a friend who visits Afrin, I was talking about earlier, who we heard her voice, and it's a very difficult situation. And I remember one of the things she said to me was really similar, which is that she really wants the voices of people in Afrin, the situation there, to be public news.
Yeah.
Like, and I think that's very important.
Yeah.
Is that the main city that they've taken, Afrin, and are there other cities that Turkey's taken too?
It's a province.
Yeah, it's a province. So they've taken the province of Afrin. It's like, and also a few years ago, in it was 2019 or 2018?
Yeah.
Anyways,
19, yeah.
2019 they took they created a security belt, which if anyone knows the word security belt, it never means security. It usually means imperialism or colonization of some kind. They created a security belt in the northern part of a small strip in the north. Well, sizable, yes.
Sizable.
Strip, and
relative to the
and so that area has also been taken over and is currently occupied, and it's tough. It's really, really tough for those people. And I mean, if you can imagine, you did so much work to create this new kind of government, this revolution, and then just like overnight, these like militant groups come in and they take over, and it's really, really rough.
It's pretty demoralizing, right? Because now if they're trying to build, something similar where they got displaced to, right? There is always a threat of another invasion. So, people are afraid to rent a home because you never know when the invasion comes, right? It's really cool.
We have another question there.
Yeah, I'm just a bit more curious about the material situation in the ground. So you mentioned there are blockades of a lot of things. There's obviously the constant threat of bombing of civil infrastructure. So in terms of like self-sufficiency in the region, in terms of food, like what is the situation? Are there some things that people have in general and some really key things that they are missing?
Yeah, good question.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak a little bit to it. When I was doing research, one of the questions I asked people was like, how are you getting food? Like, what are your markets like? Like, what's the life there? Because I just wanted to know, because I know what the embargo is. And the impression I got is that, it varies. So in a place like Kamishlo, where I was studying, that's a place that tends to get, it's one of the bigger cities in Rojava. So it tends to get supplies. That's why a lot of internally displaced people come to Kamishlo. So I learned about that, which I think is, in terms of Rojava, in some ways is maybe a more privileged city. And so they have goods that are smuggled in, either through Iraq, I don't know if any is smuggled through Turkey.
Yep.
Yeah.
Business goes on as usual, war or no war.
Yeah, they smuggle. So their prices change. Sometimes they're very expensive. And that impacts people's reality. In some places, though, I think it's worse off in comparison, where there's not the same access. Would you agree, Anya?
Yeah. But also, like, more broadly, right, they do want to achieve economic self-sufficiency, but it's difficult because there was no industry, pretty much before the revolution started.
Yeah.
Why? Because the Assad regime just used it for, to extract some
resources,
wheat and cotton and oil, right? So they intentionally didn't build any factories. They intentionally didn't build refining facilities. So they're in a situation where they need to build everything from scratch, and
then things get bombed.
Right.
Yeah.
But there is an intent, and for example, with cooperatives, right? They made an official decision that we're gonna create cooperatives not just in the agricultural sector, but also in industrial. Like, it's slow, but yeah. But yeah, they're just not at the point where they can provide for the population by themselves.
Yes, I know. I was just about to grab my charger.
I'm curious what the relationship between the autonomous administration and like the Assad regime is right now, because obviously the Assad regime is not happy with them, but also it seems like there is kind of a sort of truce or like an alliance of convenience in some ways. Like in 2019, they relied on Syrian troops to sort of stop the invasion.
Could you listen for me?
To contain it, yeah.
There's one right there.
Yeah, it's you said it right. It's an alliance of sorts. So the Assad regime, right, is too weak, right, to take any action on its own. It's been propped by Russia. The only reason why Assad has survived is because of Russia's and Iran's support, economic and military especially. But as I said, because you have, as you said, like a cocktail, right, of interest in this region, right? In the United States, you have Turkey, and then you have Assad and Russia and Iran, who are sort of operate as a bloc. None of them can take a decision, right, about this region by themselves. Like they need to, behind the scenes, coordinate with other powers, and and make concessions and make deals. So at the moment, Assad and Russia just can't move into that region, because of the U.S. interest, because of Turkey's interest, right? They also have to kind of balance out how much Turkey gets out of that region. Turkey controls, as we've discussed, several parts of Syria, so they have leverage too. So they're just waiting for the moment, right, when for example, if the United States decides to withdraw, that will be a good moment for Turkey and Assad to come together and make a deal, right? Who gets what part of this
Sykes-Picot Part 2.
Right, and then maybe, right, they'll be forced, the Thomas administration, as they were in 2019, to make a deal with Assad, right? Because ultimately there'll be a better deal, sadly, than a Turkish invasion. So then
Sorry.
Oh,
No,
I'm sorry.
continue.
I was gonna say, this has come up before in like conversations I've had with comrades, where with folks that I know on the left here in the West, it almost like it's a very rare and controversial thing. It almost breaks our brains to say in this moment a United States military presence is actually being a hedge against other imperialist powers. And I found that to be very controversial trying to discuss that because of how universally we're, as leftists being, U.S. being enemy number one. And I don't know what more to say about it other than just to say that, like, imperialism itself is evil. Or it's not evil, but it's a force that acts on its own.
Right.
But
and there's no one imperialist power in this country, in this world.
Something I would say to it is that, and I think this is to your point, there are things that could be solved through diplomatic action. And I think Kurdistan would really, really value from diplomatic action and pressure for diplomatic solutions. I think you'd agree on it. I think that's most important. And instead of getting that, what they get is this kind of military solution. And I don't mean military. Yeah, it's not the resistance and I'm not talking about that, but the imperial military, like the forces from proxy. They get that stuff, and it's in many ways it's not sustainable because
not at all.
Yeah, because even with this revolution they're doing, for how long can you be at war? Like if you're at war forever, that impacts the society.
Or like what kind of changes this reliance on the U.S. May cause kind of inside the movement, right? If the movement needs to cater, right, to the international or state community, what does it mean?
Like the weird fetishism of Kurdish women, that's like so bizarre. I don't know if anyone's followed that, but like there's this conservative movement in the United States where there's these Republicans usually who are very pro-Kurdish in Kurdistan. And they just very openly fetishize Kurdish women. It's very creepy. And, like, that kind of stuff, I can't imagine that has, like, a positive impact on anyone.
Sorry, I was extremely late, and you might have already covered it. So I was wondering how close the Russian troops are and how much of influence, if they do have, onto the daily life of people. Because one of the few regions where American and Russian troops can come to face, and I heard anecdotes where they are visible from each other. They're just carrying out their routines, but what is that like for the local people?
Oh yeah, you said it. There are occasional patrols.
Yeah.
When Trump declared that he was withdrawing the troops local people started throwing stones on the U.S. patrols. I mean, but otherwise, other than that, there's, as far as I know, I mean, interactions. Like I was told that they do come in contact with the locals. They kind of have to, but it doesn't have a sort of a big presence. It's quite limited.
Yeah, I interviewed a soldier, not a Russian soldier, an American soldier, and the impression I got was they really only had interactions with very specific controlled settings people. They were not just having a lot of interactions in general. It was more like, okay, you're in the military, this is your military goal, here are the people you're going to interact with to get that goal accomplished, which I think is kind of typical for a lot of these kinds of wars, where when people do see military, it's usually in a kind of removed way. I mean, obviously not removed if they're attacking you, but removed in terms of just like being stationed there. Would you agree on it?
Yeah.
Yes.
By the way, people should feel free to leave if anyone
you
wants
can
to
also
leave, but
stay whatever you like.
Doesn't feel comfortable like passing here.
So as a clarification, is it fair to say that basically, practically, private property is not a thing in the region? And related to that, because the society is organized in a different way, I'm imagining, when we talk about the crime, the justice system, there are some things that maybe just don't occur, that maybe we see in the US. So in your experience, like what are the things or what are the common things that are brought up in the restorative justice system as like things that are occurring that people go to courts? So like what are the quote unquote crimes?
Yeah. No, you would be surprised to see how like normal this revolutionary society is. Like you may imagine this is just so different from what we experience in our lives, and then you go there like, oh my gosh, it's normal people. Like sometimes it's even hard to believe that there is a revolution happening in that region, and private property is still there, right? They're not. Their economic program doesn't involve taking people's stuff. They kind of the movement over the years sort of have decided that's not gonna work, and they also don't think that small scale private property is necessarily negative in itself. So while they're trying to expand the cooperative sector, their vision for the future is that people who want to be small producers, they would have the right to do that, right? So yeah, you'll still have robbery and stuff, and the economical situation is so bad that people will have trouble surviving.
Yeah.
It's there's an economic crisis in Syria more broadly, but also in Rojava because of all the challenges we've discussed. So yeah, but the most exciting is probably like the women's house, because that's just fun to witness. Women who run this house, talking to men who are brought there by their wives, because they, misbehaved, and some of them actually get put in jail, right? There are degrees of tolerance, right? This restorative justice you can go into, but yeah.
I mean, I'd heard for robberies and stuff and like economic problems, there was also restorative justice that tried to happen there. So there's a series of communes that you go to, and there's a kind of like a series of decisions that are made about your situation, and it takes time. It's not immediate, but people decide, like groups collectively decide what they think occurred, and then they'll make a decision. And so I was given the example of someone, for instance, who was supposed to complete a task and, let's say, fix something in your house, and then they didn't actually fix it. And so now you're in a dispute, and you're going to court. So instead of a traditional thing where you have a lawyer and everything, there's like an economic guild, something like that. And you go to them, and they try to work between both of you to come to some kind of solution, which they feel is like ethically correct for that situation.
Should we call it the night, or?
Any more questions, or are we all good, folks? And you can feel free to talk to us also.
Yeah, please come and talk to us.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you all.